So I am Lavanya Ramakrishnan. I realize my name's not showing up correctly as well. Let me rename myself. And I am the PI for the STRUDEL project and also lead a number of efforts around data and workflows here at Berkeley Lab. What we're going to do today is give you a quick introduction and then basically jump into the tutorial itself. So if you want to switch slides to the slides. All right. Next slide. Okay, so I am not going to go through this agenda quickly, but what I think is important to know is there's a break around 11:30. The goal here is really to follow along. This is a little bit hard to do on Zoom, but we're going to try and do our best. And please feel free to speak up or raise your hand or use the chat to interact with the organizers. Next slide. All right, so I just wanted to give a quick background before Rajshri and Cody take over the tutorial part. I think knowing sort of where we come from and our background is important to understand how we are approaching this and understand where some of our biases might lie as well. So we are at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, which is one of the DOE, Department of Energy funded national labs. And Lawrence introduced big team science in 1931, and LBNL is the first national lab. So what you see on the left here is a picture from the 1930s where Lawrence put together a team which was very interdisciplinary. So it had people from various backgrounds coming together to work on the hard problems that were faced right around sort of building the cyclotron and things like that, right? So the view is incredible from the lab. We also have a lot of Nobel Prize winners here. And we live in sort of the computing sciences area, really trying to work closely with different sciences, making sure that we can serve the needs of the end users. But the most important things is team science is at the core of what we do here at Berkeley Lab. And it effectively building diverse teams is really part of our mission. Next slide. So my background is in workflows, and my team typically has been addressing this question of how do we enable researchers to effectively and efficiently manage their computation and data. We have a number of user facilities here at Berkeley Lab, which produce a large amount of data. The light sources, the Joint Genome Institute, Molecular Foundry are good examples. And we also are home to the high-speed networking that connects the DOE national labs to the rest of the world called ESNet, and home to NERSC, which is a supercomputing center. In addition to that, we have a number of projects that produce a large amount of data, have complex workflows. And so we've been trying to address the question of, how do you build the data abstractions? How do you make sure that the HPC and distributed resources are available? How do you ensure reproducibility, search, data extraction, data change, sort of the whole spectrum of data and lifecycle management. So a lot of what comes in STRUDEL comes from our experiences and the needs that we've seen in these environments. Next slide. So STRUDEL, what is STRUDEL? Other than it's a fun pastry that I wish I could eat every day. It's all what we refer to as STRUDEL is an open source project that enables teams to create user-centered software for scientific communities. So it's really grounded in science, open source, as well as in just making sure that UX principles can be more widely used and adopted in the communities that serve science. It is funded by Alfred Sloan Foundation, and we recently have been funded to add more partners to the team, and we're very excited to have Superbloom, 2I2C, BIDS, and Carpentries as part of our team, sort of to take STRUDEL to the next stage. So STRUDEL has two parts. Typology of scientific framework is being something we have been building out to really understand how scientific software depends on various social factors and sort of project structure and composition and goals of the project, and how do you sort of build sustainable software long term is something we worry and think about a lot. And our goal is there to really build a strategic planning framework that projects can use to see how we can help projects build sort of UX, UI into their current processes, but also sort of start to think about sustainability and maintenance of software. But today's tutorial is largely about the design system, which has task flows, it has mockups and implementation. And Gratri and Cody are going to sort of walk you through being able to understand what these task flows are and how you can use them to build your own web UI frameworks. Next slide. So UX, what is UX? I think a lot of people now are familiar with user experience, and it's widely used in industry to build the phones and the shopping sites and search and everything else. It has also been used in academic environments and science environments, but to a lesser degree. And that's where sort of our team has been sort of building up expertise over the last decade or so, but also now trying to say that this is something a lot of teams could use and take advantage of as we sort of build this ecosystem around our research software engineers and open source and scientific software and things like that. What user research gives you is a process to verify and validate your intuition about what user needs, which is, I say is similar to a scientific hypothesis, and convert it into a step of actions. We have user research experts, and I'm lucky to have a number of them in the team, but I do believe this is a skill that everybody should pick up if you're building software or building tools, or you lead projects that are building software and tools, because it really will improve both the usability of your software, but also the long-term sustainability and stewardship of the software. Next slide. All right, this is just a quick slide to give you an idea of the kind of things we've been up to over the last little over a decade. We have much longer been applying what was then called user-centered design in LB&L projects. And then around 2012, 2013 is when we really sort of adopted this as part of our strategy. And we've had sort of, I'd say, two types of projects, some in which we come in as consultants sort of working on design and research for a software team, but we've also sort of adopted this into our research and development practices and sort of trying to build some core UX, UI tools and expertise that are critical and informs the larger community at large. So STRUDEL came about because we'd written white paper to a DOE workshop, and that it led to Sloan seeing that one and saying that they were interested in these ideas. And so the Sloan STRUDEL project was first funded in 2022, and 2024 is when we've had our first release, and then we have the formation of the STRUDEL version 2 team that is actually very new. We just had our kickoff meeting last week. Next slide. So how do we define user experience? I think this is hard to do, but we like to say that the practice of developing services and products that provide an experience that's consistent, relevant, productive, and joyful. It's also important here to remember that there's a common misconception that UX is purely focused on graphical user interfaces. That's not true. UX practices can really shape everything from internal organizational processes, software development, backend sort of design and architecture, and UIs of all kinds, including APIs and things like that. And also just sort of thinking about how systems and users interact with each other. Next slide. So a lot of what we've done in STRUDEL is to abstract out some of the common patterns we see in science UIs and UX, And so if you look here, we found that we were building some of these same interfaces for different communities, whether it's scenario selection, selecting inputs, dashboard summary of results, and history. So that led us to sort of saying we can now abstract this out. So anybody who wants to do this has a starting point that they can sort of build off of from. And then we've taken that concept and sort of the sequence of screens that leads to a certain type of activity is what we call a task flow. And Rajshri will go into that in more detail later. Next slide. All right, I think we're ready for our next Menti question. So in 3 or less words, what's your role in a scientific software process or team? And at this point, as you enter these questions, I'm also going to hand over to Rajshri, who will tell you more about the Strudel design system. And if anyone has any questions, I'll also be here. So feel free to unmute and ask or put it in the chat.
We'll wait a couple of minutes for everyone to answer, and then we'll move on to our next phase of the tutorial. Cool. These are some cool answers. Let's get moving. So thanks, Lavanya, and thank you everyone for joining us here today. And I'm glad to see diverse pool here. So in the next section, I'll be talking about the Strudel design system. Let me start by touching on what a design system is. So it's basically a set of reusable components and patterns for designing and building user interfaces. And sometimes they also have like guidelines on how and when to use all these reusable components. And in the industry, many companies like Google, Salesforce, IBM, etc., they all have created their own design systems so that they can ensure all their different products have a consistent look and feel and hence a smooth user experience. But Strudel is a bit different. It is more than just the style of components and buttons. It focuses on a larger flow of a task, which is to be accomplished through a scientific application, which Lavanya previously mentioned is what we refer to as task flow. And we have built the student design system for interfaces, particularly in the science domains, and it is built to be consumed by people who do not have enough time and resources to invest in UX UI development. And we envision that the student design system will be used by many different users. For example, UI developers can use this to build a demo UI or prototypes very quickly. Designers can also reuse the design files we have to make quick mockups for new features and workflows they have to build. Software engineers and domain scientists who are not well versed with UI UX concepts can still use this to build their UI for their own projects with low effort. And PIs and funding agencies can also leverage this. They can use this as example UIs for starting their initial team discussions and as a reference for good UX practices in science softwares. So Strudel does not require any prior UI design or development experience as such. And as we mentioned earlier, the Strudel design system is heavily based on the larger flow of the task, which we have defined as task flows. So a task flow is a series of steps which is represented by screens. that help or guide users to accomplish a particular task in the science software UI. But you can also think of it as starter templates for different workflows within the science UI. And we designed all these task flows with good UX in mind. So all that is already built in. So for the preliminary release, for the first release of our STRUDEL design system, we identified this preliminary set of different task flows like run computation, explore data, contribute data, monitor activity, etc. And we tried to bucket them into relevant groups. But we know that this is not like a comprehensive list, and that's why we are looking for a lot of community contributions for all the different task flows which we have not covered, and even variations for all of them. I'm sure all of these will have multiple variations. So a best way to illustrate what a task flow is I'll walk you through an example. And this example is based on one of our STRUDEL users who adopted the system, and how they decided what task flow to use and how to go from idea to a working prototype. So this STRUDEL user, they didn't have a lot of UI and coding experience, but they knew a little bit about Python, and they had this idea to build a UI, and they started implementing the UI the normal way and realized it was getting quite complicated. But then they learned about STRUDEL through a newsletter in our lab, and that's how they decided to try it out. So the idea they had is basically they have a data set of daily experiment logs, and they wanted to share all that information with their team and enable the team to access that information, scan it, and filter it easily. So they decided that a website will be a good way to have this use case implemented, and a website with an organized view of all this information with scan and filter features should be doable and should be easy to get it done. So I'll be walking through the website strudel.science on how to navigate the website and select what task flow to decide for your project, but you can also explore this on your own parallelly. So yeah, this is the strudel.science, the website for the Strudel project. The homepage talks about what the Strudel project is, and um, they came here, they saw that, oh, you can build scientific QIs, and they said, get started. And then they land on the design system overview page, which talks about what a design system is and how to use the design system. And then they say, okay, let's explore the task flows they have, which gets us to the task flows page, which has list of all the task flows we have published for the first version. So you browse through the task flows and you can read what it means, what features they have. And as they were browsing through this, they saw explore data, which has some sort of tabular layout with search filter, search sort, etc. And they decided to explore this. They read the guidelines, they read more details, and they saw the live example, which is there. And they just played around with it and decided that, okay, this looks kind of useful. All these features are built in, and they decided that they want to implement this for their use case. So that is how they decided on what task flow to use. And next section, we will cover on how to implement this task flow. But before that, I would like to ask the room here another question. What are the different task flows you have encountered in the science applications you have worked with or you have used? So looking forward to all the different task flows. And if you're still confused on what a task flow is, just think about what different workflows your app is used for. So as simple as that. You can write sentences. It does not have to be 2 words or anything. Cool. So these are some very cool task flows, and we definitely have to implement all of these. So next we'll see on how to implement the task flow, which we just walked through. And I'll hand over to Cody for this section.
All right. Hi, everybody. My name's Cody O'Donnell. I'm one of the team members on the Strudel team. And so right now we're going to talk about how actually implementing a Strudel task flow into the beginnings of a web application works. So next slide. The first thing we want to do is just get a sense of what people's backgrounds are that are on this call, so we kind of know how much detail to go into as we explain some of the concepts of different tools and programming languages that are involved with developing with Strudel. So it looks like we have a lot of Python users, C++, C, so definitely some programming experience, but not a lot of web development experience, so a lot of other more back-end or analysis kinds of applications. A few people with some React and some JavaScript, CSS and HTML. Cool. So as we go along here, we're not going to assume anything about, or we're going to try our best to not assume anything about your background with some of these technologies. At times, some things may be a little new or confusing, but we'll be trying to go through that together. So what we're going to do today in some of the hands-on tutorials is we're hoping that by the end of it, you'll have learned, one, some familiarity with modern web development architecture and how Strudel fits into that architecture, how to configure a Strudel task flow, and then we'll also cover some very basics, kind of a crash course on building basic React components and also how to use basic Material UI library components, which is a library of components on top of React, which we'll get into more. So Strudel Kit is the open source library that the name of our open source library that we use to take Strudel task flows from that design phase to that next phase of starting to build an interactive web UI. It consists of two main pieces. There's the low-code command line starter tool, which is just a simple convenience command line tool for generating the code that you need for the different task flows that you're going to be building. And then there's the actual templates themselves, which are written in React and have a pre-built, pre-baked in tech stack, which we call the Strudel tech stack, which includes a bunch of modern open source tools and curated resources to help you get building with those. Next slide. So to give some grounding as we get started talking about web applications, when we're talking about a web application, first of all, there's a lot of different ways that you can build out your application. There's a lot of different kinds of architectures, but we're going to focus right now on one particular common kind of architecture, which separates things into the data layer, which includes your databases, so your structured or unstructured data, and then your application layer, which communicates with that database and creates an interface for pulling data out of that database and maybe sending data back in. So that's usually what the REST API is handling. And this application layer can also include other services like authentication. And then what we're going to be most focused on today is that presentation layer. So this is the app interface that ultimately shows up on a user's local device. And that's what STRUDEL can help you build. So why would you use STRUDEL? Well, first, it helps you jumpstart your UI with repeatable patterns and layouts. So a lot of times when you're building UIs, you may be finding yourself repeating the same things over and over. And so this is one way to help you get started without having to repeat all of the same kinds of UIs that you may have built in the past. But on top of that, you're baking in designs that are vetted by experts in the field. And so you have some confidence that the design and flow of your application is going to work well for your particular problem. The other nice thing about STRUDEL is that you can configure a lot of UI details without actually going into the React code. So we'll show you how to do that in the first section of our tutorial. And then the other nice thing is that you avoid vendor lock-in because really what you're building with Strudel is just starter templates. And so from there, you can branch off and you have full reign to customize your project however you want from there. Next slide. So for today, we're not going to focus too much on the command line starter tool. We're going to jump into a coding environment which has already generated that starter code for you. But instead, next slide, we'll focus mainly on these React templates themselves and how to get started editing them and configuring these different task flows. Next slide. Okay, so within these templates, I mentioned there's a stack of open source tools that they're built on. So the first one, starting from the bottom, is called Vite. Next slide, which is just the local server that the app is that builds and runs the app. And next is TypeScript, which is the language that the app is built in, which if you aren't familiar with TypeScript, it's just a version of JavaScript that has types associated with it, similar to typed Python. Next slide. And React is the base app library for building out the web application. So this is kind of like the framework for the web application. And then the next is the material UI components, which offers low-level UI elements for different components that are used around the web UI. And one thing to note about Material UI is that Material UI is kind of like another design system in and of itself. And we chose not to reinvent the wheel on the lower level and instead focus on, like Rajshri mentioned before, that higher level UI components and flows within a UI. And so GenRouted is the page routing library, which is built on top of React Router, which uses a file-based routing system so that the actual pages and URLs within your application are generated based on the file structure in your file tree. And then lastly, we have Plotly.js is baked in as the visualization library for the task flows that use data visualizations. Next. So what we're going to be doing today, and what you usually do when you're configuring or starting to use a Strudel kit template, is it can be broken out into two phases. The first is configure, and this is when you're specifying structured UI details, and this is specific to the task flow that you're using. So each task flow has a specific configuration file that goes along with it that you can configure some of the UI details, and we'll get into that. And then also you can configure using MUI, the global theme for the web application. So that's some of the styles across the app. And then, like I said before, after you've generated a StrudelKit template, you have all of access to all of the code within the template. It's not hidden behind any sort of black box or anything. And so the customization step is when you can, it requires more of a full code experience and more knowledge with React, but you have the ability to edit the templates and create new interactions and add in the requirements that are necessary for your project. So next. So today we're going to, the practical part of today is broken out into four main parts. The first is we're going to do a configure task flow step, which is going to take about 30 minutes. We'll see how it goes. And then we'll go into configuring the theme of our web application. Then we're going to take a 30-minute break around 11:30. And then we're going to do, like I said before, we're going to do a little bit of a crash course on React and MUI so that you can have some knowledge going into the next phase, where we're going to do a little bit of customization on the Explore Data task flow. All right, so with that, I think we'll switch over to sharing my screen. And if we could share the first thing I'm going to share is a follow along document. So just give me 1 second for that. I just need to make sure I share the right screen. Okay. Okay. Are you all seeing my screen okay?
You might zoom in a bit.
Sure. So the first place that you're going to start is on the follow along document. So this is something that you can use as we go along through the steps today, to follow along each step as I'm also going to be coding it live. The next thing you can do is in this helpful links stage, open up the code editor. You can click this Stack Blitz code starter, and that should open up a UI that looks something like this. And you can let that'll take about a minute or so to download the dependencies and get everything up and running up on that page. Yes, yeah, we have a sandbox environment called Stack Blitz that we'll be using. So just to give you a quick overview of this document, so this will show you the code snippets that I'll be typing in to Stack Blitz, the Stack Blitz project as we go along, which feel free to either type along with me or grab the code snippets and copy and paste those in as we go along. And so what you should have now is the starting point for the Stack Blitz project. And we're going to be doing a little bit of configuring and coding within this environment. So you shouldn't need to create a username or user profile for this to necessarily work. If you would like to save your progress for a later date, you can create a username now, and then you'll be able to hold on to this code forever, but you'll also have access later to this starter template as well as the finished result after the tutorial is over. But just to give you a quick overview of this interface, over on the left-hand side, we have all of the files within the project that you can browse just like a regular file tree. In the middle, we have our text editor where you can open multiple files and edit. And then down below, there's a terminal, which is running the web application right now. And we're not going to be using the terminal today, hopefully, so you can minimize that below. And then over on the right side, we have our preview of the web page that shows up in our web application. So I'll give people just a minute to get situated in their environment, and then we'll get started. Another thing to note about Stack Blitz is that you can save your progress even without having a user profile. You can save your progress as you go, and you can even refresh the page and you'll still have your progress saved. The other thing I'll note is if you get lost at any point, you can always jump in by clicking on the Live in Progress Stack Blitz link, and then you'll be caught up to the point at which I've been coding. I'll note one more thing is we have in our with us right now, we have Mike Pesci and Sheng, who are both here to help you both in the chat if you have issues that you run into or questions. And there's also two breakout rooms, one called Mike's room and one called Sheng's room. So if you run into an issue where you need individual help on something, like something's really stuck and you can't figure out how to get it working, you can just message Mike or Sheng in the chat, and then you'll coordinate going into one of those breakout rooms. So with that, let's get started with the first configuration step. So like I said, in this project, this is something that you will have in a normal environment, you will have created with the command line starter tool. And right now it's a base. It includes the base app, which includes the scaffolding for a web application in React, which includes all the stack of tools that I mentioned before. And then it also includes one task flow called Explore Data. And the task flows live inside of the SRC or source folder, and then under pages. And you should see a folder called Explore Data in there. And that represents all of the files for that particular task flow. So if you go over on the right, you see the registered pages over here. So we have a playground page, we have the home page, and then we have our Explore Data task flow page. And it also indicates the file that is the entry point for that particular task flow. So if I click on that, looked like there was an error at first, but if I just refreshed that preview window, that fixed the issue. Sometimes this stack blitz can be a little bit quirky, so just hang in there with me and we'll try to get through things together. So this shows the live example of the Explore Data task flow in its default form. But what we want to do is start configuring this task flow to incorporate some of our own data and some of our own features. So that's what we're going to be doing today during the tutorial. So the first thing that we're going to do is open up the configuration file for this task flow. So inside of that source pages explore data directory, we have our _config directory where there's a file called taskflow.config.ts, and that's what we're going to open up first. So in here, we have a JSON-like configuration that describes some of the UI details for this task flow. Things like the data source and the titles and a few other things that are represented in the UI. So the first thing that we're going to do is edit this data source field and change this to use, instead of right now, it's using a local file that's a local CSV that's in the public folder of the top level of the application. We're going to change this so that it uses a link to an API. So if you're following along in the follow along document, we are just at step 1 right here, update the data list object. So the first thing I'm going to do is change the source to an API that we're going to work with today called the GBIF API. This is an API that, an open API that includes data about species observations around the world. So we're going to use that in our example today. So right now we've just changed the data source, but we have a few other things that we need to change. Static params is not something we need to worry about today, but this is just if you need to include extra parameters in your query link every time that you run. Like, let's say that there's a format option that needs to be added to the source every time you run a query against it. You can include that in the static params. The next is the ID field, which maps to a field within the data set that's represents a unique identifier. So instead of ID in this field, or in our new data, that ID field is going to be called key. And then the next is the server mode, or the query mode, rather. There's 2 different kinds of query modes with this particular task flow. There's the client mode, which is what the default is, where we have all of our data represented and pulled in at once, and all of the filtering happens on the client side, on the JavaScript side. But in a lot of cases, and especially if you're working with larger data sets, this doing client-side querying is takes too much power to do. So instead, you do something called server-side querying, where you just are paginating and pulling a little bit of data at a time, and also tacking on filters to the query endpoint that you've supplied in the data source. So at this point, you should be seeing the page updating a little bit. We don't have any visible data, but we are seeing that our initial data source is not there anymore. So that's a good thing for right now because we've changed our data source. The next thing is to change the data source for the detail page. So this particular task flow has two different pages. It has the main list page, which we're looking at now, but it also has a detail page for drilling into the data and showing a more detailed view page. So for that, we have a separate data source. So now we're on step 2. And for that, we're going to use a different endpoint from the gbif API. We're going to keep the static params as null. The ID field, again, is going to be key. And the query mode is going to be server. Okay. So that's it for the data sources. Next is the actual page components. So the first thing that we see here is the title of the app, which right now is Explore Data App, but let's change it to something that's more indicative of what our new app is going to be. We'll call it Biodiversity Explorer. And you'll see over on the right that title page is, the title on the page is being updated. And then let's do the same for the description. So instead of description of this app, we're going to change this to explore species observations around the world. And we should be seeing that update on the right. We'll give people just a minute to catch up there. The next thing that we're going to do is update the table column definitions. So right now, you'll notice that there's not actually any data showing up in our data table. So that's not super useful. But that's because we're still seeing the same columns that were in the default data source. So instead, we want to update our column definitions to include table or columns rather for the data set that we're using now. So for that, first I'm going to delete all of the definitions that are currently there, but I'm going to keep the array brackets importantly. And the first thing I'm going to do is add a first definition. And the first thing I need to do is specify the field. So this is the field in the data set that maps to, this will map to one of the properties in the data. And we'll map it to the scientific name property. And we'll give it a header name. We'll call this the name of the species. And then we'll also give it a width. This is in pixels. And so we'll say that's a width of 200. So now we should see our first column showing up with data over on the right side. So this is data that's coming from the data source that we specified and in the scientific name field within that data source. Next, we'll add a field for the year property. And again, we'll give it a header name. We'll call it year. And the years are a little smaller, so we'll give this a width of 150. We'll add a third for the basis of record field. And so real quickly, if you're following along in the document, we're now at step 4, update the column definitions in pages.index.table columns. And we'll give that header name. Basis of record. And again, we'll give it a width of 150. And then we'll add one more column here for the elevation field. Give that a header name. Give it a width of 150. And then because this field is a numeric value, we'll give it a type number. And that'll add some extra styling to it that's specific to number columns. So you'll see it is aligned to the right side of the column, and a lot of the data here, at least on the first page, is empty. So that just gets a dash. Okay. Oh, I must have made an error in the basis of record. I said base of record. It's actually basis of record. There we go. So now we have our 4 columns of data coming from our data source. Those aren't all the columns, but those are all the columns that, let's say in this example, we want to show in our table. So we'll leave it at that for now. And the next is our filter definitions. So you'll still notice in the UI that we're having filters that are related to our default example. So now we want to change that. So the first thing I'm going to do is delete the 2 filter definitions. And I'm going to add a new one. So if you're following along the document, we're now on step 5. Update the filter definitions in pages.index.table filters. So let's add first one for the elevation field. So similarly to the columns, you start with specifying the field. That is the property that you want to filter on. So we'll say elevation. The next is a label for that filter. We'll also call it elevation. The next is a param type. So this controls how the values are added to the data source endpoint when the filter is applied. And in this case, the param type, we will call it array string. And then the next is specifying a filter component. So this is the actual kind of input that will be used for this filter. So we want it to be a range slider. there's a few other options for the filter components. The two that are most well supported right now are called range slider and checkbox list, but there's also date range and text input or text field rather. And so after the filter component, you can specify the filter props. So these are options that get passed to the filter type that you chose. So because we chose a range slider, we have to specify a min value, we'll call it 0, and a max value, we'll call it 100. So now you can see over on the left, we have a filter that's showing up. That's a slider with a minimum value of 0, maximum value of 100. So let's see if it's actually working. So let's roll that to, let's say, 50. And now we see our elevation column is getting filtered down to values between 50 and 100. So that's great. So that filter is working. I'll give people just a minute. I'll stop there for 1 minute to see if, give people a moment to catch up with that filter. And then we'll make one more filter before we move on to theming. The break is at 11:30. So we have one more step here in the configuration step, and then we're going to do theme configurations, and then we'll take our break. Those should be around 11:30, might even be a little before. Okay, so let's do the last filter definition. This one is going to be for the basis of record field. We're going to give it a label, call it basis of record. We're going to give it a param type. And in this case, the param type is called repeated. And then the filter component, instead of using the range slider, we're going to use checkbox list. And for checkbox list, for filter props, so these again are the options that get passed to the specific filter component. So for a checkbox list, we need to add a list of options. And for each option, there's a label and a value. So instead of typing each of those, I'm going to copy and paste those in from the follow along document. And now we see the basis of record column with 6 different checkboxes there. So let's see if that's working. Let's check preserve specimen. Good. That looks like it's working. And let's see if we can also tack on our elevation field filter at the same time. And that one's also working. So it looks like we have 2 new working filters. And this is starting to look nice with our new data set. So in the next step, we're going to customize the theme. And for that, we're going to open up. So if you're following along, the follow along document, we're at the customizing the theme step. And we're first going to open up this source theme.tsx, whoops, file. So yes, if you're having a little trouble following along, remember you can always jump in to the point that I'm at right now by going to the top of this link or the top of this page and going to the live in progress link, and that'll catch you up to where we are so far in the tutorial. So that'll give you the full configuration steps that we just went through. Okay. So the next thing, like I said, is we're going to make some theme customizations. So we're going to go inside of the SRC folder and open up theme.tsx. First, I'm going to save this so that the people that go to the live, before I saved it, you may have not gotten the updated config. So just in case you did do the live link, you might have to click that live link again now that I've saved. Okay. So looking at the theme, so this is now using the Material UI global theme configuration. So this works similarly to the task flow configuration in that we have a JSON-like object that specifies details about our application. But in this case, we're just specifying details about the styles and theming and layout type elements of our application. And here in source.theme.tsx, we can make sweeping changes to the theme that get applied across the application. So it can be very handy in that regard. So what we're going to do is change our whole app to be in dark mode instead. So let's say that's the kind of app that we want to build is going to be in dark mode. And then we also want to apply our own project's colors to the application. And so we're going to show you how to do that. So the first thing is changing this mode. I'll zoom in a little bit in case that helps. The first thing is this mode field. We're going to change it from light to dark. And so what that did is it didn't actually change any of the background colors, but it changed the inner components so that they are using a light foreground color instead of a dark one as it was before. So the next thing we need to do is change the background colors. So the first is the default background. This is the main background of your app. We'll change it from right now, it's like a silver. We're going to change it to a dark gray. And then we also need to change the background of the papers. The paper refers to these panel-like components that get used across the app in different components. So we're going to change that to a little bit of a lighter gray so that it shows up on top of our background a little bit. So that's starting to look good, but let's now change our main color palette to match a new set of colors. So let's say um, in so within this color palette configuration, you have many different kinds of colors that get used for different types of components throughout the application or different variations of components. So these are things like buttons can be used as secondary color or an info or success color, or by default, they'll use the primary color. So right now we're just going to change the primary color of our application. So I'm going to change the main version of the primary color to a light green, and then I'll change the light and dark versions of the primary color to different versions of that green. And then we also have this contrast text option, which right now is set to white. This is the hexadecimal code for white. However, we can also comment this out and instead of specifying the contrast text explicitly, this will calculate the contrast text automatically based on the other colors being used within the palette. So that's a little handy feature that MUI gives you. So right now, if you're following along, we're at the customizing theme stage, and we've changed the mode, we changed the background colors, the primary color, and now we'll change two more things in the theme, the border radius and the font family. So coming back here, I can scroll down to, there's a lot of options here for you. You can change a lot of the different colors, different aspects of the fonts. But right now we'll just change this border radius field from right now, the border radius is a value of 4, which is causing these curved edges around the panels in the application. So let's change that to a 0 if we want to have sharp corners. And you can see how that took effect across all of these different components at the same time within the application. And then the last thing we're going to do is change the font family. So right now we have the primary font is Helvetica, and then these other fonts that you see here are backup fonts, just in case a user's system doesn't have the ability to show a particular font. So for right now, let's just change the primary font from Helvetica to Avenir. And again, you can see this made a sweeping change across the whole application. And now all of the different components are using the Avenir font. So before we take a break? Maybe I'll stop for some questions about configuration, and I'll give people a minute to just catch up with some of the steps, or catch up on the using the live progress link in the tutorial. So I'm definitely been seeing some action in the chat, but if anyone has a question or a discussion topic that we want to do before the break, we're happy to do that now.
Cody, if I really wanted to go crazy with theme customization, I assume all of this stuff is documented somewhere where I could take a look at what all the different options are and what they do.
Yeah, definitely. So these are, so this is using the Material UI theming configuration. So this is documented in the Material UI documentation under, they have a whole section on called customization,
Okay.
which shows you the different theme options and other ways that you can customize some of the different values. And we're going to talk about later on another way to do some additional theme or styling customization for individual components. Okay, if there's no questions, you should feel free to take your break a little early, and we will reconvene at, let's see, what did we say in here? We'll reconvene at 12 o'clock, where we'll continue the follow along, and we'll do the, so let's see. So right now we've done the configuring the task flow. We did a theme configuration exercise, and now we'll take the break. It'll be more like 40 minutes, but I'll stick around for a little bit until 11:30 if people have other questions or just other things they want to talk about before before I take a short break as well. And then we'll finish up doing a little crash course on React and MUI basics, and then finish with doing some customizations in the Explore Data task flow. So thanks everyone for sticking with me so far. I know this can be, it can be a little grueling looking at curly braces and commas, but all right.
Cody, can I just get you to join in this conversation in the chat where I was asking where the boundary between Strudel and React and Material UI sort of really is? I am not a deep web guy, so the tutorial you set up has, what is that, 50 different small files, and there's some Vite, there's some React, there's Material UI. Where's the strudel stuff? Is that the task flow things? Is that
Yeah.
what I identify as like that's strudel?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So there's kind of like two aspects to that I would say. Is the first is Strudel is kind of this opinionated way of using a series of open source tools, including React and MUI, but it's also particularly the most, I would say the most strudely part is the task flows themselves and the ways that they're configured. So there's for each task flow, there's a set of templates that inside of this base application, each task flow that we have, I think we have 6 different ones implemented right now. And we're working with one called Explore Data, where this includes the templates for this particular application flow. And then it's sort of the combination of the screens that you use to flow through that particular task flow, as well as the configuration file, which helps you configure certain details about that part of the application before you dive into the actual template code, React code for those task flows. Does that help a little bit?
A little bit, yeah. I guess it's the example of putting the theme TSX, which is a global Material UI theme. Like, could I theme a particular application, like Explore Data, separately from the playground, or is
That's a good question. Right now, the theme is global. So if you had, let's say you had multiple task flows, yeah, the playground would be themed the same way with the global. But that's a good idea, really, to potentially partition these and
I'll
theme
step
them
this back. I'm
differently.
trying to figure out, of all these files, which one would a developer or a user or a scientist be encouraged to, like, here are knobs you should play with, and which
Yeah,
ones are that's just all boilerplate. Every React app has that. Don't worry about it.
yeah, I would say the knobs that we want people to
Yeah,
play with
cool.
is the configuration.
Okay, thanks very much. It's great.
Yeah. All right. I hope everyone had a nice break. If you got some lunch or at least stood up and got on your feet for a little bit. So I just want to check that you're able to see my screen correctly. Do you see the follow along using StrudelKit slides? Okay. So in the first 2 parts of the hands-on piece of this tutorial, we did we configured the Explore Data task flow to use a new data set, and we configured it to show the columns that we wanted to show, as well as 2 new filters configured to filter the new data set that we connected. And then we moved on to looking at how to configure the global theme using Material UI. And now we're going to, so that was what we were able to accomplish using configuration alone. So this was without even jumping into the React code, simply just changing some of these JSON configurations. But in most cases, you are going to want to make additional changes to your application, make it look more the way that you want, function more the way that you want. And with the StrudelKit templates, what they give you as a starting point from which you can continue to build on top of them. And so we are going to first do a little crash course in React, because I know a lot of you are new to React and in that ecosystem. And then we're going to do a quick little crash course on what MUI can give you on top of React, and how to work with some of those components. And then we are going to build something in isolation and then bring it into our Explore Data template and start customizing one of the preview panel aspect of this template. So if you're following along back on the follow along document, and a reminder that if you miss the first steps, you can either join to where we are now in StackBlitz using the StackBlitz Live in Progress link, and that should get you to where we've gone now. But even if that's not working for you, these steps can be done even with the default data set and configuration from before. So feel free to just kind of follow along from whatever point that you were able to get at. So the first thing that we're going to do, so where we are now, just coming back to this document, is we're at the React Basics step, and we're at step 1. There's also a link here to a React syntax cheat sheet that you might find handy either during this tutorial or later on in your journey building with some of these kinds of tools as we go along here. So that's just in case you want to have a little more detail about the syntax, some of the syntaxes that we go through today, but I'm going to try my best to explain and give context for everything that we code up in this next section of the tutorial. So the first thing that we're going to do is come back to our StackBlitz environment, and we're going to, for now, go back to our home page by clicking on the My Project link, and we are going to first create a new folder in the pages folder called Hello World. So I'm going to go into Pages, make a new folder called Hello World. And then inside of Hello World, I'm going to make a new file and call it index.tsx. And so what we're doing now is we are, one, registering a new route to our application. So you can see by making this Hello World folder and index.tsx file within it, over on the right side, there's a new Hello World page added to our application. And we've also created a file where we can start building a React component. So within React, everything is based around this concept of a component. And a component can be something as big as a page or as small as a button or even an icon within a button. And so what we're first going to do is make a component for the Hello World page. So the first thing I'm going to do is define that component and call it Hello World page. And then because we're using TypeScript, I'm going to specify the type for this component, which is a React.fc, which stands for functional component. Then I'm going to initialize the function. And then I'm going to return what we actually want to display in the UI, which in this case is going to be a div that says hello world. And then lastly, I'm going to export this component so that it is registered with the hello world page. And it looks like Stack Blitz got a little messed up, but I think if I refresh and go to hello world, now we see our hello world text. So let me walk through this again to give a little context to what we just wrote. So first we defined our component. So hello world, this is the name of the component that we're building. This name can be any name for a variable. However, in React, it's generally a convention to name these starting with a capital letter and then camel case following that. We specified a type, which is a React functional component. We initialized our function, and then every React component is going to return something. And usually this is something that displays on the UI. And once you, in this return statement, we're using a syntax that in React is called JSX. And JSX is similar to HTML. You may be looking at this thinking this looks really strange, or this looks like we're writing HTML. And essentially we are. So in JSX, you have access to all of the same elements that you have access to in HTML. Plus, you can include JavaScript and other React components within these kinds of return statements. So we'll get a little more practice with that as we keep going. And I know for some of you, you may have experience with React, so some of this might be review, but just bear with me and feel free to follow along with whichever pieces you would like. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is create a second component that will then include inside of our Hello World page. So the next thing I'm going to do, and if you're following along, we're now at step 3 of the React Basics part of this tutorial. So the next thing we're going to do is create a folder inside of Hello World, the Hello World folder called _components. And then inside of there, we're going to create a new file and call it tag list.tsx. And so now we have a new blank file where we will specify a new component. This time we'll export it initially from the get-go and define this new component and call it tag list. It's a general convention to name your component the same name as your file. However, this isn't strictly required. And again, this is a react.fc. And in this case, what we want to return is a list of items. So we'll use the unordered list element and then an li element. And let's say what we want to build is something that can display taxonomic information in a structured way. So then we include some taxonomy information, close that list item. We'll add another list item. And then I'll save that. And so this is looking good. We have a new component which will render a list of 3 items, and it should say Animalia, Chordata, and Mammalia. However, right now, we're not actually using the component anywhere. So in the next step, what we want to do is embed the tag list component inside of the Hello World page component that we made previously. So I'm just going to close out of these other files. So we just have these 2 open right now. So now what we want to do is go back to the index.tsx file that we made and import the tag list component. And we want to import it from that components folder that we made and the tag list file. The next thing we want to do is actually use this component inside of the Hello World page. So I mentioned before that in these return statements, what you actually display in the UI for a component, you can include HTML, but you can also include JavaScript and other React components. So the way that we do that here is first I'm just going to make a little space just so that it's more clear. You'll notice that I added parentheses when it's a multi-line return statement. And underneath Hello World, we're going to use the tag list component. And now you should see on the right side the 3 list items that we created in tag list underneath the Hello World text that we made in the Hello World page component. So this is very simple, but it should give you a little idea of how React components can be used as building blocks to create a user interface. But where React really shines is through using a concept called props for their components. And a prop is information that gets passed down from one component to another. And so this makes it useful so that a component doesn't have to define all of its information in and of itself. It can receive dynamic information from other components and then generate that information and display it in a structured way. So what we want to do, it's kind of like, if you're familiar with other programming languages, it's kind of like an argument into a function. So what we want to do is create a tags prop for tag list where we can, instead of statically specifying these list items here, we want to make it so that it could be any list of items that we choose. So going back into tag list, and so just orienting ourselves in the list here, we are now at step 6 of the React basics. So the first thing I want to do, because we're using TypeScript, I need to define an interface for the kinds of props that are allowed to be passed in to the tag list component. And so I'm just going to call these tags. And then next I'm specifying what kinds of values should be allowed to be a tag. And I'm going to say tags should be a list of strings. The next thing I need to do is include this tag list props interface to the type of the component. And the way I do that is after react.fc is I add an extra bracket here, and I include that list of components here. So now the tag list knows that it's expecting a component called tags. And so then inside of the function, I can specify the tags prop. So this indicates the information that's getting passed into the tag list component when it's being used. And it's going to be called a variable called tags. The next thing we need to do is actually use those tags in our component. So instead of specifying each of these list items explicitly like this, we're going to loop through tags and display each list item dynamically. So inside of JSX, I've mentioned that you're allowed to type JavaScript. The way you do that is you use curly braces, which essentially indicates that you're now in JavaScript land rather than HTML land. And now what I'm going to do is take this tags list and loop through using the map function each tag. And then now we're back in HTML land. So I am going to specify for each tag, we want to create a list item. And the content of that tag should be the tag value itself. So that's the individual string from this iteration of the loop through the tags that we'll use for the content of this list item. And then one other thing you have to do is specify a key for each list item. And this is just something that is required in React so that each item has a unique key to it. Okay, the next thing we need to do is, so we should be seeing an error over on the right side. And the reason for that is because right now our component is set up to expect this tags prop to be required. And over in the Hello World page, we haven't actually passed any data to our component yet. So now let's go back to that index.tsx and specify values for that prop. So if you're following along, we're now at step 8 in the React basics. So the way that you pass values to the tags or to a prop is in the component, you type the name of the prop equals brackets, and in this case, it's a list of strings that we want to pass. So now let's type out a list of strings. Animalia, Chordata, Mammalia. Okay, and so now we see those 3 list items again. However, this time we're populating that component using the props string rather than the static data that we specified before. So this could actually be any length now rather than just 3. We could say 4, we could say 5, we could just keep going. And the beauty of this is that you can also then specify, you can use data sources to populate the data within that component, which we'll be doing a little bit later in the tutorial in the last step. Okay. So that covers the basics, the very basics of how to make a React component and how to use props to pass information from one component to another and how to display those components on a page. And now what we want to do is learn how to use a few components from Material UI. So Material UI is a separate JavaScript React library, which includes a lot of low-level components for common elements that you would see in a user interface. And the Strudel templates utilize Material UI for these low-level components. So right now, what we're going to do is first work with the chip component to replace the list items in our tag list. So I'm going to go back to tag list. And the first thing we want to do is import the chip component from MUI. The next thing we want to do is, instead of using these regular list items for our to display each list item in our component, we want to display chips instead. So I'm going to replace the li with chip, and the way chips pass data is through a label prop. So I'm going to close that chip and use the label prop. to pass the tag value to the chip. And so now we can see over on the right side, we see these chip components being used to display each of the items in our tag list. So I'll stop there for a minute and let people catch up, because I know we've gone through a lot the past few steps. Okay. Next, we are going to talk about the stack component from MUI. The stack component is used to display elements in rows or columns and use consistent spacing for the elements within a stack. And so what we want to do is use a stack to space the elements out in our tag list. So first, we're going to add stack to our import statement. And then we're going to replace UL with the stack component. And so we see by default, it renders the items vertically in a column. So to fix that, we're going to use a prop option on the stack called direction. And we're going to say direction is the row. And just a reminder that all of these options are documented within the Material UI component documentation. So that's the direction prop, and we'll use one more prop called spacing to space these out a little closer, and we'll say the spacing is 1. Okay, so that's starting to look a little nicer for our tag list. Now we're going to hop over to back over to the index.tsx page and talk about the typography component. So the first thing we want to do is add the import for the typography component, just like we did on the tag list page. So the typography component is used to display text of all kinds in a consistent format. And so you can use this for titles, you can use it for body text, you can use it for content, or other headings throughout your, or labels throughout your application. And it allows you to do things like change the font size in a structured way, change the font weight in a structured way. And so what we're going to do is change this hello world to use the typography component. So first I'm going to wrap it in a typography. And initially that's not doing much, but if we use the variant prop, we can change the size of the text, the size and the style. So we'll change this to H3. And now we see that the size of the font has increased. But let's say that we want it to have the style of the H3 version of the typography, but we still want it to use an H1 component because it's the title of our page. So, or an H1 element, HTML element. So what we would do there is use the component prop and set that to H1. And so now that doesn't change the display of the text at all, but it does change it so that it is using an H1 in HTML. And that's just something that's nice to do for screen readers and the way that HTML gets parsed. Next, we are going to use the container component to wrap all of this content that we've made in our Hello World page. The container component is a common wrapper that is used to control the width of content within a page, and it's also used to make the content responsive to screen widths. So first, let's import a container. So if your preview pane has stopped recognizing changes, there's a few things you can do. Sometimes Stack Blitz just loses that connection. So the first thing you could do is try to just refresh using the button up here. And if that doesn't work, you could try refreshing the page entirely. Or what you could do is you could try opening the preview in a new tab and then clicking connect to this tab. There's a button that will display. And sometimes that will fix the issue for you. Sometimes opening in a preview tab in a new tab and then closing it and reopening back in the main window will even fix that issue too. So the container we've imported, and now we want to wrap the content using a container instead of a div. So, okay, we can see that that added a little bit of spacing on the left side of our content. And now let's use the max width prop to make sure that we have a smaller container. We'll use the small size, which is SM. And so now you can see that now the container width is contained or constrained to a smaller size, even when the width of the window changes. Okay. The last thing that we're going to do with MUI before we move on to pulling some of this code into the task flow is talk about the styling individual components using the SX prop. So if you are following along, we're now at step 7 of material UI basics. And I'll give people a minute there just to catch up some of the material UI changes. Okay. So now we're going to use the SX prop to make some style changes to the Hello World header that we have here. So SX is a form of inline styling that you can use in MUI, similar to using regular inline styles. However, there's a few changes or a few differences that I'll cover as we go through it. And with styling here, you're also free to style in other more traditional ways using CSS files or SAS or SCSS files. But one of the ways that we found is the most helpful, especially when you're doing quick prototyping, is using the SX prop. So I'm going to indent these to make it a little easier to see the values in the SX prop that we do. So this is just for visuals. And so every component in MUI has a prop called SX on it. And within that, you can pass an object. So note the double curly braces here. In that, you can pass an object of styles to any individual component. And within here, it's essentially like we're writing CSS. So first, I'll specify a bottom border. So border bottom. And I'll say it's 1 pixel and it's solid. And we see that that border shows up underneath the hello world. And then we'll add a border bottom color. And so here we can specify any color we want. We can specify a hexadecimal code. We can specify a regular color. But the beauty of the SX styling system is that you can also access the styles from that main theme that we configured earlier. So instead of using a regular hex code or color style here, and I think that I lost my connection similar to problems some people were having. So I'm going to try to refresh here and see if that works. Oh, actually, I just forgot an R. Okay. So you can specify colors normally using a hex code or just the name of the color or an RGB value. But you can also specify them from the theme. So I can use the primary keyword and then write .main to use that primary main color that we specified earlier in the tutorial. And so now I can see that the border underneath Hello World uses that green color that we added to our palette. And then the last thing I'm going to do here is just, for fun, add some margin bottom, and then I specify 2. And here is another feature of SX that's different from regular styling, is that for things like spacing, so for margins and padding, you can use predefined fixed levels of spacing. So right now, we can specify 2, which doesn't actually mean 2 pixels. It means a level 2 spacing, which is configured. That value is a configurable value within your theme. And then the last thing I'll do is do the same, but for padding. I'll do padding bottom and set that to 2. And so now you can see that added some spacing below both the hello world text and then the border underneath it. So this is starting to look a little bit nicer. And this is something that you can do, remember, on any MUI component throughout these templates. So the last thing that we're going to do in our tutorial is take some of this stuff that we learned and use it to modify the Explore Data task flow template. So I'm going to go back to the Explore Data task flow. So I'm going to try to do that here. Sometimes it gets a little messed up. Yeah, it looks like things got messed up for me too. So let me try the other method I suggested. So that works. That's one way you can do it, is to use a separate tab to display your preview. However, I'm going to try to bring it back. And that's still not working. So I'm going to do a refresh here. But I'll make sure I save my progress. Okay. And so while that's loading, I'll bring back up the, I'll go back and I'll close out these files that we made. And now I'm going to go back into the Explore Data task flow template section here. So while that loads, I'll just give people a minute to catch up. And I'll orient us back in the follow along document. So now we've finished the React basics and the Material UI basics, and we're now going to talk about customizing the task flow. Give that just another minute to load. Okay, there we go. That's a good note from Steve in the chat. If you were stuck in the Hello World page because there's no back button in this preview panel, you can right click and use the back feature. That's a good tip there to get back to the home page. Okay, so now I'm going to go into the Explore Data task flow from the home page. And so we still have everything that we configured before. We have our filters, we have our columns that we've set up. But now we still have our preview panel has boilerplate information in it. So what we want to do now is update this preview panel to use data from the row particularly that we are clicking on. So we can see that that top level title changes, but nothing else changes. So the first thing we want to do is open up the component that controls the preview panel. So inside of the SRC pages explore data folder, there's a folder called underscore components. And inside there, we have each section of this task flow separated into its own component. So if we open up the preview panel part of this template, we can begin customizing the content within that preview panel. And so here we have a component similar to the ones we made before. We can see there's props associated with this component. There's some things being imported, and it's a component named preview panel. And then we see down in the return statement, many of the MUI components that we were using before, and a couple new ones being used to display all the information here on the right that you see. So what we want to do first is utilize that tag list component and use that to display taxonomic information about the row that has been clicked in the data. So now the first thing we want to do is import that tag list component. And we import it from that Hello World folder that we made. And now, normally you might co-locate this component file somewhere else, like inside of this components folder, or maybe in a higher level component folder. But for right now, we'll just leave it where it is in it, and we can just specify where it's being imported from. So now we've imported the tag list, and now what we want to do is we're going to replace this row description, title, or helper text area with with a tag list of taxonomic data. So scrolling down to line 50, I see row description, subtitle, or helper text, and I'm going to delete that whole line. And now I'm going to add a tag list. And just like before, I'm going to use the tags prop to specify the values. I'm going to close out that tag list component. And so right now, it's blank because our list is not populated with anything. But what we want to do here is use data from the row that's being clicked. And so the preview panel template has a prop associated with it called preview item. And whenever you click on a row in the table in the Explore Data task flow, the preview item is populated with data from that particular row that you've selected. So that data is passed in to the preview panel through the preview item prop. And so then what we can do is use that preview item to access the data in that row. So what I'm going to do is for the first tag item, I'm going to write preview item dot kingdom, which is kingdom is a column within the data set. And so now, if we click on one, we see Animalia showing up underneath. So let's keep on adding other taxonomic information here. So I can also do preview item dot phylum, preview item dot class, and preview item dot order. And I can save that. You can see when there's a linter, an automatic linter in this Stack Blitz environment that when I save, that's why it added these extra lines here. Those aren't strictly necessary, but you might notice that happening if you click save. So now when I click on one of these rows, I see data about the taxonomy for that particular row. And I can see that when I click on different rows, that data changes depending on the row that I've clicked. So now let's do one more thing here where we'll add, because we've only included parts of the taxonomy, let's include the rest. And for this, we'll just add a second tag list so that it displays underneath the first one. So we can reuse the component, specify the tags prop, and then again use the preview item to access the data. And this time we'll use family, preview item dot genus, and preview item dot species. And then I need to close my component. And so that's looking pretty good. So we see, I'm just gonna make this a little bigger here. We see information about all the different taxonomic information. And now we could do some things like you'll notice some of the pieces of data don't have all the taxonomic information. We could make it more advanced where those items wouldn't render blank like that. But for now, we're okay with the way it's rendering. And the last thing we're going to do is finish changing some of this other boilerplate information here. So first, there's actually not a step for this one, but because this data doesn't have any nested related data within these rows, we can delete this related data table. So to do that, we can just go down, scroll down in our template to where it says related data, and it's wrapped in a box component, and we can delete that whole section without any sort of ramifications. And now the last thing we'll do is update the property group 1 and property group 2 with data about, with more data about the row that we've clicked. So first, let's change property group 1 to hold location data. So I'll change that to location. And then we want to display data about the continent, data about the country, and data about the municipality. And then under value, instead of these value strings here, we can again use the preview item to access data for each of those properties. Preview item.continent, preview item.country, preview item.municipality. So let's just make sure that's working. Looks to be. I see information about continent, country, and municipality showing up in our preview panel now. And then for property group 2, so we're now on the last step in the follow along document. Looks like there's 2 step 4s, but we're on step 4, number 2, the last step here. So we'll change property group 2 to record. So we'll include data about the record here. And we want to include the basis of record column. This will be the same one that we showing in the table, but it goes with this section of data, so it would be useful to display alongside preview item dot basis of record. Then we'll also display the protocol. Preview item dot protocol. And we'll add one more line here underneath. For status. And that's going to just be preview item dot occurrence status. Let's make sure that's working. Looks to be. So again, you'll see some of the items are missing data. So we could, a future task would be to add in some handling for those missing data so that it displays something more sensible, or maybe doesn't display at all. But this is looking pretty good. So now what we have here is something that took the template from the original Explore Data task flow and reconfigured it to use an external data source and modified it so that the boilerplate content is now utilizing data from the new data source that we've connected into this task flow. So a next step for this task flow would be to, like I said, do maybe some things with the missing data. And then also configured in here is a link to a detail page, which is not really built out, but this is something that you would be able to build out using some of the components that we talked about today in the lesson. Yeah, so the last thing we're going to do is just have a few wrap-up slides and then have some time for questions and discussion towards the end. So we covered a lot of different topics today. We've talked about user experience and how we define user experience in the Strudel team and how that applies to our work. We talked about Strudel as a project and the design system that we've are building out based around these Strudel task flows. We've talked about React and MUI components, some probably new concepts for a lot of people here, maybe review for others. But I hope that you came away learning a little bit more about these technologies than you came in. We talked about SX styling, where you can modify specific styles and aspects about particular components. And we also did some work with, again, we were using TypeScript, which is just a typed version of JavaScript. And we talked about JSX and its relationship to HTML and how it's used within React. And we did talk a little bit about page routing and how that works within the Strudel kit system. And so really the Strudel kit is meant to just be a starting point for your projects or your prototypes that you're building. And so here is a list of several different resources that you can use to continue your UI journey. The first is our internal resources for the Strudel project. So these are task flows, the pages that Rashri was demonstrating earlier today, as well as documentation about the Strudel kit and everything we went through today. And then over on the right side, we have a few curated lessons that we think are very useful and helpful related to React and Material UI. So feel free to, maybe someone could post the link, make sure the link to the slides are in there. I think there's a link at the top of the follow along guide on the website. So you can make sure that you have access to these resources. The other thing that we wanted to touch on briefly is hosting for your app. And so right now, your app is technically it's hosted on Stack Blitz. And so when you're developing in a Stack Blitz environment and you're only using building out front-end UI technologies, you can use a system like Stack Blitz or GitHub Pages to share your work with other collaborators. However, if you have something that's a little bit more robust, like it has a database or an API connected with your system, that's where you might want to start looking into different kinds of hosting options. And so two that we're showing here and have links to getting started are one's called Heroku, which is a useful place for hosting apps for free. And then also Firebase. There's also Firebase is a larger, I think it's a Google-based cloud system for hosting your apps. So that's more for like production ready and larger projects that need additional resources and computing resources. There's also AWS is another option there for more production ready. But if you're really only at the prototype stage, your best options are going to be using tools like StackBlitz or GitHub Pages or Heroku. So what's on the horizon for our project, or at least particularly the Strudel kit? There's a lot more that we want to build on top of this tool. The first would be more advanced UI feature implementations. There's so many different aspects about a UI that can be implemented and that can be common to different kinds of projects. And so those are the types of features that we want to keep building into these templates so that they're more robust and more useful and applicable to different projects. We also want to make more configurable options so that there's more that you can do without even touching the React code. We also want to continue to expand our documentation with more examples and tutorials for how to customize these templates. And then we're also working on and interested in hearing from the community about new task flow designs and building out templates for those, both from a design standpoint and a coded implementation standpoint. And then we're also interested in this idea of creating hosted environments for people to make it easier to share your work with people before you're at ready for the stage of jumping to production. And so this is kind of an exploratory project that we're doing with 2i2c to see how we can help people share and host their apps kind of when they're at the prototype stage. We also have the post-tutorial survey, which if someone could post a link to that in the chat too, which we could really use people's feedback on one, how we did today and how we can make these types of tutorials and workshops better, but also how you can impact the future of this project and the directions that we take and the types of things we focus on. So lastly, this is just different ways to get involved. We have our website, strudel.science, which Rajshri demonstrated earlier, which is the best place to just start and learn about everything related to this project. And there's also the US-RSE User Experience Working Group, which many members of our team are a part of and collaborate with closely, which is a great place to just learn more about user experience and become part of that community. There's also the Strudel mailing list if you want to stay up to date on what's going on with our project and in the user experience community. And then also there's our GitHub pages where you can stay up to date with what's going on with our code base and what kinds of updates we've been working on, as well as if you want to participate with our project. It's a completely open source tool, and we're really hoping to build somewhat of a community of people that can contribute their ideas or code to our templates or even entire task flows themselves. So if that's something you're interested in, we'd love to talk with you, and you're welcome to reach out to us through our email or through GitHub, and we'll start that engagement. So with that, also, if you're interested in co-hosting a local hackathon, we would love to chat with you. So with that, we thank you very much for taking your time. I know this was a long tutorial where we covered a lot of different things, from the Strudel project to coding in React and Material UI and configuring task flows and learning about what task flows are. So really thank you for your time. And yeah, we'd like to open it up to questions or discussion if anyone has them. Yeah, there's a question about the licensing. It's an LBNL license. And yes, it's open to, it doesn't have any known restrictions. So it's similar to the MIT license, but it's something that we have to go through with software that comes out of LBNL where it gets the LBNL license, but it is free to be taken and used and modified however you see fit. Great. If there's no other questions, feel free to drop off. And again, I really encourage you to take our post-tutorial survey and also the DEI survey that Peng Yin posted earlier, just to collect some information about the types of people that come to these sort of events and are part of the US RSE community.
Cody, I might have missed it while looking through the docs, but do y'all have kind of like a showcase of sites that have been built with Strudel just to give me an idea of all the fun things I can do with it?
That's a really good question. I would say we're still very early, so some of the users that are using us are kind of in the early stages of their project, but that's
Oh,
definitely something that we want to share on the website. So right now, no, but hopefully in the future.
okay. Yeah. I mean, the tutorial I think gave us a really good idea for how it all fits together and how you customize it and stuff. I just would want to see a bunch of examples to just, stir my imagination.
Definitely.